I want to talk to you about ministers and taxes. And so here's an overview I want you to pay attention to. So in today's conversation, I want to give you the ultimate tax guide for ministers. And so when we talk about ministers, ministers actually have a unique tax situation because even though they are employed by a religious institution, they follow unconventional rules when it comes to their tax return. And the thing is that we first need to define what a minister is for tax purposes, because minister for tax purposes is not associated with Christianity. Okay, so the IRS states that the word minister does not reference any specific religion and is used broadly to describe a leader in any religion. So for tax purposes, ministers must actually meet the requirements and be licensed, commissioned, or ordained by their specific religion to perform ministerial duties. So this can include preaching, conducting worship, and also maintaining a religious organization. And so it's really important to really understand that. And so now our ministers, traditional employees, because before we can talk about their tax nature or the taxation model, we need to know what kind of employees they are. Now, the thing is that ministers are really treated as a hybrid of a self-employed worker and a traditional employee for tax purposes. So you have this sort of two facets of the same person, okay? Self-employed worker, and the other facet is a traditional employee for tax purposes. So in most cases, the congregation is a tax-exempt entity. That means the church, the mosque, or the synagogue, or anything else, the temple, is actually the minister's employer. And so basically, the congregation does not withhold the income tax from the minister's wages. However, in almost every other aspect of the law, ministers are considered employees. In short, a minister must pay taxes like a self-employed worker, but they are not eligible for all the tax benefits many self-employed workers really enjoy. So you can see that we really have here a very specific situation, a very specific tax situation. And I'll explain a little more later, but it's really important to understand that they have a few benefits, but they also have a few drawbacks. By the way, boss, welcome back to the show. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Make yourself comfortable. You are going to enjoy today's conversation. So when we talk about a minister's gross income, what is really included in that amount? Well, a minister receives payment in exchange for different services, including from people outside of the church, right? Donations and so on and so forth. In some cases, we have subsidies too. So when it comes to reporting their annual income, a minister must include amounts received for performing marriages, baptisms. You have funerals, counseling, and other services in addition to their church salary. So this is really important. And so if they receive a housing allowance, they must also include the portion that exceeds the fair value of the home. And this amount should be entered on a Schedule C. And so any goodwill or love offerings to a minister must also be included in gross income. The only time offerings made directly to the minister are tax exempt is when they are retiring or leaving the church and giving a farewell gift. In that case, they don't have to report that as income. If a minister gets sent on a missionary trip to a foreign country by the church, the income earned during the trip is still subject to federal income tax. Therefore, they might also owe taxes to the foreign country. Okay, and ministers can actually take the foreign earned income exclusion, the foreign housing exclusion, and the foreign tax credit to avoid being taxed twice on this income. Now, when we talk about housing allowance, what is it really? I mean, what is the housing allowance exclusion for ministers? Now, the thing here is that many churches give their ministers a housing allowance, and that allowance might be a cash amount, or if the congregation provides a home, the monthly rent value. Okay, so when I say many churches, it can be many synagogues, many mosques, many temples. It can be many congregations. Okay, and so this money, the housing allowance, must be part of the minister's salary and be used exclusively for providing a home. And it can cover the following costs. So we have rent, we have mortgage payments, real estate taxes, home insurance, utilities, furniture, repairs, and other expenses. And this allowance can actually be excluded on a minister's tax return, but it should not exceed the home's fair rental value, including furniture and utilities. The extra portion of a minister's housing allowance is taxable if the amount exceeds the fair value. Okay, so some districts allow ministers to exclude a housing allowance for 2 homes. However, in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida only allow 1 home. In addition, a minister must reduce the deductions they take for business expenses by the percentage of compensation attributable to the tax-free housing allowance. However, itemized deductions for mortgage interest and real estate taxes can still be taken for the full amount. Very important. By the way, boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We are having a conversation about ministers and taxes that ministers are responsible for paying. And in some cases, ministers can actually request that the congregation withhold the income taxes from their paychecks. It really depends upon the kind of setup that the congregation has. Okay, but what we have seen in our research is that usually ministers must use a Schedule SE to calculate their self-employment tax. And even though a minister can exclude the housing allowance from their gross income, they must include it when calculating the self-employment tax. So to avoid an underpayment penalty on their tax return, basically ministers should also pay quarterly estimated payments. And ministers are basically not eligible to file a Schedule C to deduct business expenses related to their wages from the church, the mosque, the temple, or the synagogue, or any other congregation. However, they can file a Schedule C to deduct the costs incurred from marriage, funeral, and other services performed. And how can a minister really apply for a tax exemption? It really depends upon that minister. So let's talk about self-employment tax exemption. So a minister can apply to be exempt from paying the self-employment tax. This exemption will only apply to their wages from the congregation, not other services performed. To do so, the minister must fill out Form 4361, and attach a statement explaining that they have taken a vow of poverty or oppose public insurance. And this application should be completed after the second tax year in which they earn at least $400. And then the minister must meet one of the following tests: a religious test based on the doctrine of their church or their mosque or their synagogue or their temple or their congregation in general. That's the first test. Or a conscientious opposition test. And so if you have any questions, just let us know. We'll be very happy to explain those things to you. And so one stipulation worth noting is that if a minister applies to be exempted from the Social Security tax included in the self-employment tax, they will not be eligible to receive benefits from Social Security in the future. Once the exemption is in place, it cannot be undone. So you also have a federal income tax withholding exemption. So if a minister wishes for a congregation to withhold the income tax from their paycheck, they may apply for an exemption using Form W-4. Now, let me give you a little bit of approach when we talk about ministers and taxes. It's really important to understand that if you are a minister and you're listening to me right now, you are subject to some tricky income tax and Social Security tax rules. Okay. And so how your income is taxed, how to claim an exemption from self-employment tax, how to get a tax-free Personage Allowance, limits on deductions if you get a tax-free allowance, where to report your income, and deductions that you can easily overlook. So how is your income as a minister is taxed? Well, if you're a minister of a church, of a mosque, of a synagogue, of a temple, or whatever congregation, your earnings for the services you perform in your capacity as a minister are subject to self-employment tax unless you have requested and received the exemption that I just spoke about, either of the two exemptions. And so this includes what? It includes any salary that is paid to you as an employee of the congregation, even though reported on Form W-2. And so that what happens here is that basically we're talking about your income, but we're also talking about offerings and fees, such as those for performing functions. Now, it's very important to keep track of everything, because the IRS, you do not want to be audited by the IRS and get in trouble here. Okay. And it's really important to understand that if you're looking for exemptions, you gotta really we have to really solidify your paper trail, because the IRS is not going just to grant the exemption without really doing some research. One thing I also need to see here is that when we talk about the special functions of your church, of your synagogue, of your mosque, of your temple, things like ordinances, things like sacraments, things like, those things, they actually fall under a different category, and you have to actually document everything, including the expenses and the wins, if you will, and the income that you actually derived from those special circumstances. Okay, and because the thing is that if you are going to apply a little one for a reduction of income, let's say you're going to apply for deductions, you better have the proof to back up everything. By the way, boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We are having a conversation about ministers and taxes. Now let's talk about personage allowance. Now I've talked about personage allowance before, but it's really important to really talk, like I want to emphasize that point because it is so critical to a lot of ministers in this country. So ministers can really exclude from their income a rental allowance or the fair rental value of a personage that is provided to them as pay for their services. And so this exemption applies only for income tax purposes, and we're talking here about federal income taxes. Okay. Maybe in the states where you are at right now, they're probably taxing you or not taxing you. It really depends. Please check with them to have more information here. And so when we talk about the exclusion that I just mentioned to you about, that exclusion does not apply to self-employment taxes. You still are liable. You still should file your self-employment taxes. And so for a payment to qualify for the income tax exclusion, the congregation must officially designate it as a housing or rental allowance before it is actually paid. And a definite amount must be designated, and the amount of the allowance cannot be determined on a later date. If you receive a rental allowance, you can exclude it from your gross income if the amount is used to provide or rent a home and it doesn't constitute excessive pay for your services or exceed the fair rental value of the home, including furnishings, plus the cost of utilities, okay? And if the congregation provides a residence, you can exclude from gross income the fair rental value of the house, including utilities furnished to you as part of your earnings. So, but just like a rental allowance, the exclusion cannot be more than the reasonable pay for your services. And if you actually pay for the utilities, you can exclude any allowance designated for utility cost up to your actual cost. So this is really an important element to keep in mind, because otherwise you will be just getting a lot of allowance and really ending up paying the IRS a lot more. Okay, let me really understand. Let me tell you that if you have any question, please let us know in the comment section, and we'll certainly get back to you. And one thing I want to say here is that when we talk about ministers and taxes in general, you have to understand that things keep changing, and it depends also on the Internal Revenue Code, but also your state tax ordinances. Now let's talk about where to report your income. So you report your income in different places on your return, depending on whether it is salary, W-2 income, or self-employment income. So if it's salary income, you report it elsewhere, but if it's self-employment income, also it goes elsewhere. And so income that you receive from offerings and fees, you want to report this as self-employment income on Form 1040, Schedule C, Profit and Loss from Business. Your salary income, report this income on Form 1040. Expenses related to your salary income. So for tax years prior to 2018, report the expenses as miscellaneous deductions subject to the 2% limit of adjusted gross income, AGI, on Form 1040, Schedule A. And it's one of those things where you have to understand that the expenses must be prorated between your W-2 income and your housing allowance, making a portion of them non-deductible. Okay. And what about expenses related to your self-employment income? Well, deduct these expenses on Schedule C. Examples include what? Travel, office expenses, subscriptions, books, and computers. Now, there are some easy to miss deductions for ministers. Ministers should make sure they don't fail to claim this key two tax write-offs: the self-employment tax deduction and the health insurance cost. Let's talk about that. So for self-employment tax deduction, you can deduct half of your self-employment tax on Form 1040. as an adjustment to income. That's number one. Number two, you have health insurance costs. So you can deduct the amount you paid for medical and let's say dental insurance, and actually a qualified long-term insurance for you, your spouse, and your dependents. So, and what I want to say here is that this deduction does not reduce your net earnings for self-employment tax purposes, and thus does not reduce your self-employment tax liability. So it's one of those things where you have to be clear as to how those tax treatments affect your tax situation ultimately. And let me give you a few pro tips here before we close to this conversation. It's very important that you work in appearance and in reality to make sure that you do qualify, you do meet the requirements to be a minister for tax purposes. Remember, basically the IRS has specific rules for who qualifies and who doesn't qualify for like the role of minister. Again, it has nothing to do with religion. Okay, you don't have to be Christian to actually use the term minister here. And so what I want to say is that when we talk about a minister, you need to understand that basically the person must be ordained, licensed, or commissioned by a local church or denomination. Okay, it can be a congregation. The person will administer sacerdotal functions. That is, they must perform marriage and funeral services, dedicate infants, baptize believers, and serve communion. And the person will be considered a religious leader by the church or denomination. The person will conduct religious worship. The person will have management responsibilities in the control, conduct, or maintenance of the local church or religious denomination. So this is an important element to really think about. And also, all five factors need to be present at the court. And the IRS actually generally use a balancing approach in making a determination. And only the first is inviolate. Someone not ordained, licensed, or commissioned is not considered a minister. This requirement, however, is quite flexible. The ordination, basically licensing or commission, may be by a denomination or by an individual church. And it is actually conceivable that someone could actually form a church and have his licensing and commission maybe my denomination by an individual church. So it's one of those things where everything is possible, you know. And so it's one of those things where you have to really make sure that you are clear about the rules here, because different churches use different terminology. So the wording does not have to be specific. And just some evidence of the church or denomination recognizing that the person is considered actually a minister by the church for the short run or the long run. Thank you so much for your attention. Really appreciate it. In today's conversation, I spoke to you about ministers and taxes. Let's do a quick recap here. So I give you the overview, then I give you the approach, and then finally the pro tips. Thank you so much. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.